In the early years of the Second World War, tanks started to feel unstoppable. Steel beasts rolled over roads, fields, and shattered villages, and most infantry weapons felt like they were made for a different kind of fight. A soldier could carry a rifle. A soldier could carry grenades. But stopping armor, up close, with something light enough to run with, still sounded like a fantasy. Inside American labs and proving grounds, that fantasy kept coming back. Not as a grand plan with years of careful testing, but as a stubborn idea that refused to die. If a small rocket could be guided by a simple tube, and if that tube could be carried by one person, then infantry might finally have a real answer. The idea was not elegant. It was not polished. It was pressure in metal, smoke in the air, and a rough promise that speed could beat steel. The weapon that would later be nicknamed the Bazooka did not arrive as a finished miracle. It arrived as a rush job. A desperate one. The timeline was brutal. In 1942, the North Africa landings were coming. American forces were preparing to fight on unfamiliar ground against an enemy already hardened by years of combat. Armor would be there. German tanks would be there. And American troops needed something they could carry, something that could punch above its weight. The first practical version of the new rocket launcher was assembled in a short sprint, driven by urgency more than comfort. Work moved fast, sometimes too fast. Engineers and officers pushed parts into shape, pressed prototypes into service, and tried to make a battlefield tool out of a workshop concept. It was a weapon born in the space between ambition and fear, the kind of invention that appears when the calendar is the real enemy. By the time the landings for Operation Torch approached, the launcher was being issued, packed, and shipped. Crates crossed the ocean. Men trained with limited time and uneven instruction. The weapon looked simple enough. A tube. A rocket. A firing system. In theory, it was almost friendly. In practice, it could be moody, fragile, and unpredictable. The first problems were not dramatic on paper. They were small, technical, boring, and deadly. Batteries were a constant weak point. Some drained too quickly. Some arrived unreliable. Some failed after rough handling. Moisture and sand did not help. Heat did not help. The firing system depended on parts that did not forgive careless storage or rushed assembly. Sometimes a launcher worked perfectly on a range, then failed when it mattered. Sometimes a rocket refused to ignite. Sometimes the trigger did its job and nothing answered back, leaving only a hollow click and a terrible silence. Training made it worse. Many soldiers had not been given enough repetition to trust the weapon or to react smoothly when it misbehaved. A new launcher requires new habits. How to load it. How to aim it. How to manage the backblast. How to keep the electronics dry and ready. Those habits take time, and time was the one resource everyone was short on. So the Bazooka entered North Africa not as a legend, but as a question mark. On the beaches near Fidala, the invasion unfolded in a blur of surf, shouted orders, and confusion. Equipment hit the sand hard. Vehicles bogged down. Men scrambled to form lines and find their bearings. This was not a clean laboratory scenario. This was a living mess, full of salt air and slammed crates. Any fragile flaw in a new weapon was about to be exposed. As the campaign pushed inland, the landscape turned harsh and wide. The desert carried sound strangely. Winds moved grit into everything. Metal heated fast, then cooled at night. Lubricants behaved differently. People behaved differently. The bazooka had to prove itself here, where a weapon could not hide behind controlled conditions. Meanwhile, enemy armor remained what it had always been, confident, loud, and heavy with threat. When a tank appears in the distance, it changes the air. Even if it is far off, soldiers can feel its intention. It is not just a machine. It is momentum. It is the belief that nothing on foot can stop it. In those early days, the rocket launcher was supposed to be the equalizer. But the first time some soldiers relied on it, they discovered the cruel truth of rushed invention. A misfire is not only a malfunction. It is a moment stolen from a person who does not have extra moments. Reports of failures began to spread through units. Not as official announcements, but as the kind of warnings soldiers passed to each other with tightened faces. Keep the batteries fresh. Keep the contacts clean. Keep the weapon dry. Handle it gently. Test it when you can. Do not trust it too much. The same weapon that could stop a tank might also betray you when the tank is already too close. And still, the launcher offered hope, because hope was sometimes all a rifleman had. A tube on a shoulder could feel like power. Even if it failed once, men wanted to believe it would work the next time. They had to. As the fighting moved toward harder tests, the pressure on American troops increased. Setbacks hit morale. Confusion layered over exhaustion. The enemy did not need the bazooka to fail every time. It only needed the bazooka to fail at the worst time. In the months that followed, places like Kasserine Pass became symbols of that pressure, where inexperienced forces faced well-handled German tactics, and where every weakness, from leadership to equipment, became painfully visible. In that kind of battle, a new weapon is either a lifeline or a cruel joke. The bazooka was balanced on that edge. And somewhere ahead, in the dust and distance, tanks waited to find out which one it would be. North Africa did not forgive weak equipment. It punished every rushed decision with sand in the gears and doubt in the mind. For the rocket launcher teams, each day became a quiet contest between what the weapon was supposed to do and what it actually did when tanks appeared. The battlefield rhythm was rough and fast. Units moved in long columns across open ground, then suddenly scattered when aircraft screamed overhead or artillery walked closer. Dust coated everything. Sweat darkened uniforms, then dried into salt. Metal parts grew hot enough to sting, and the smallest cracks in procedure turned into bigger problems. The rocket launcher, still new and not fully trusted, became a symbol of that uneasy gap. On paper it was simple. In reality, it demanded care that a frontline infantry unit could not always provide. Batteries weakened. Electrical contacts corroded. Wires loosened from shocks and impacts. Launchers bounced in trucks, slipped on rocks, and hit the ground hard during sudden dives for cover. When the weapon worked, it could shock everyone watching. A tank that seemed untouchable could be hit by a soldier who, moments earlier, felt helpless. But when it failed, it turned bravery into exposure. A team would move into position, shoulders tense, breath shallow, aiming for the side armor where the chance looked best, then nothing would happen. Smoke did not bloom. The rocket did not leap forward. Only the enemy machine kept coming, indifferent to human effort. That pattern started to shape behavior. Soldiers became careful in ways that cost time. They checked and rechecked parts. They tried to protect batteries like treasure. They avoided using the launcher unless the situation felt absolutely desperate, which was nearly every armored encounter. Sometimes they carried it anyway, because leaving it behind felt worse than carrying something unreliable. Sometimes they hated it for the weight. Sometimes they loved it for the possibility. As the campaign developed, American forces ran into a harder reality. German armor and anti-tank defenses were not simply targets waiting to be solved. They were part of a system. Tanks moved with infantry screens. Anti-tank guns covered approach routes. Machine guns punished exposed movement. The best chance for a rocket team was often a short window, a few seconds where a flank appeared and the range closed enough for a hit. In those seconds, reliability mattered more than design theory. Some early rockets had problems too. Fuses could behave unpredictably. Warheads were not always consistent from batch to batch. Storage conditions on ships and in depots did not help. Heat and rough handling could degrade performance, and the rushed production pace made quality uneven. In a comm workshop, this could be adjusted. In North Africa, it became a gamble carried on a shoulder. News of malfunctions traveled quickly. Not through newspapers, but through unit stories that grew sharper with each retelling. A launcher that refused to fire. A rocket that struck at an angle and failed to penetrate. A team that got too close and paid for it. These accounts did not erase the weapon's potential, but they carved grooves of hesitation into the way soldiers thought about it. American engineers and officers back in development channels were receiving these reports, sometimes late, sometimes incomplete, but the pattern was loud enough. The launcher had been pushed into combat before its worst habits were beaten out. That decision could not be undone. The only choice left was to fix the flaws faster than the battlefield could exploit them. While that pressure built, another force was watching the bazooka for different reasons. German troops captured examples of the launcher. They examined it as a prize, but also as a lesson. German weapons development had a strong tradition of studying enemy equipment and adapting what worked. The concept of a shoulder-fired rocket anti-tank weapon was valuable, even if the early American version was unreliable. The idea itself was sound, and the enemy could see it. Captured launchers became more than souvenirs. They became blueprints. Within German development circles, the concept evolved. The enemy worked toward a larger, more powerful rocket launcher design. This would later be known as the Panzerschreck, a weapon that reflected the same basic idea but pushed it with heavier force. The bitter irony was clear to anyone paying attention. A rushed American weapon, flawed and frustrating, was still dangerous enough as an idea that the enemy wanted its own, and wanted it stronger. Back in North Africa, soldiers could not see that full chain yet. They only felt the immediate struggle. They were facing tanks with a weapon that sometimes acted like a miracle and sometimes acted like scrap metal. They were learning under fire, updating their own methods in small ways, improvising protection for batteries, choosing closer ranges, aiming for thinner armor zones, doing everything possible to turn chance into consistency. The campaign kept grinding forward, and the pressure to improve the launcher grew heavier. The next steps would not be gentle. They would be tested in new terrain, against hardened opponents, and under the kind of stress that exposes every weakness. Soon, the rocket launcher would be forced into a moment where failure would no longer be just a disappointment, but a turning point that could decide whether the weapon survived its own reputation. War has a strange habit of recycling ideas. What one side invents in a hurry, the other side studies in patience. And in North Africa, among the scattered wrecks and abandoned gear, the rocket launcher began slipping into enemy hands, one captured tube at a time. It did not take much. A unit overrun in a fast push. A weapon left behind during a retreat. A broken launcher that still showed how the system worked. Even a single example was enough to reveal the core concept. A shoulder-fired tube that launched a shaped charge warhead with rocket propulsion. Lightweight. Simple to carry. Built for infantry who needed something more than rifles and prayers when armor arrived. German technicians did not see the bazooka as a joke. They saw the outline of a solution. In workshops away from the front, captured launchers were inspected with methodical focus. Dimensions were measured, wiring paths traced, the ignition method examined. The rocket itself mattered most, because the rocket carried the punch. It was not only the tube that threatened a tank. It was the shaped charge design, built to concentrate explosive force into a narrow jet capable of piercing armor. The Americans had rushed production, but the science behind the warhead was real. That reality did not disappear just because batteries failed or training was poor. It simply waited for someone else to refine it. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the bazooka's reputation continued to wobble. Many soldiers still wanted to trust it. Some even began to see patterns in its behavior. They learned to reduce misfires by checking connections and treating the firing components like fragile glass. They learned to keep rockets as dry as possible. They learned to aim for side armor, engine areas, and moments when tanks slowed or turned. But the weapon still carried an edge of uncertainty. It was never just about bravery. A bazooka team could do everything right, and still get nothing but a dead trigger. That uncertainty was a slow poison. Not only because it risked lives, but because it shaped how commanders planned. If a weapon could not be counted on, it could not anchor a defense. It could not be the core of an ambush plan. It became something used when nothing else was available, which is the worst position for any new technology. A weapon that is treated as a last resort rarely gets the careful integration it needs to become dependable. Back in the American system, the feedback loop tightened. Field reports described failures again and again. Misfires. Weak penetration in some cases. Rockets with inconsistent performance. Units asking for improvements that felt basic, like sturdier components and better training materials. The weapon was being tested in the cruelest way possible, by people who did not have the luxury of controlled experiments. Engineers and officers pushed for changes. Some fixes were practical and immediate. A simpler firing mechanism. Better attention to waterproofing and durability. More straightforward handling procedures. Small changes that, together, could mean the difference between a working shot and a wasted moment. But change had to move through the same wartime machine that built everything else. Contracts. Factories. Supply lines. Shipping. The bazooka could not be redesigned in a vacuum. It had to evolve while still being produced, still being sent to men who were already fighting. At the same time, the enemy moved faster than anyone wanted to admit. German development efforts, driven by their own needs and fueled by captured examples, pushed toward a more powerful infantry rocket launcher. Not a copy in the shallow sense, but an expansion. Bigger rocket. Stronger blast. And, importantly, a shield concept to protect the operator from the intense backblast and flame, because a larger rocket brought more danger to the man firing it. The result would become a serious battlefield presence later on, a weapon that could threaten Allied armor and infantry with a blunt, frightening simplicity. The bazooka's shadow was growing teeth on the other side of the line. Still, American engineers were not standing still. They were racing. They were trying to turn the original launcher into something that could be trusted without rituals and luck. They understood that the weapon's future depended on a single thing: proof. Not theory. Not testing on paper. Proof in combat conditions. And combat conditions were about to change. The war was pulling American forces toward new fronts, new landings, and new battles where the rocket launcher would again face armor, again face pressure, and again reveal what it truly was. North Africa had been a harsh introduction. What came next would be a trial where a fixed bazooka could finally earn its name, or where an unfixed bazooka could be discarded as an experiment that arrived too soon. The weapon's next proving ground would be rocky terrain and desperate encounters, where a single successful shot could turn panic into momentum, and where a single failure could erase months of effort in one brutal second. By the time the war's focus shifted toward Sicily, the bazooka was no longer just a new tool. It was a problem that needed to be solved before it ruined itself. The early weapon had delivered enough disappointment to make men cautious, but it had also shown enough potential to keep engineers fighting for it. This was the tension that shaped everything. A weapon that could change infantry survival could not be allowed to stay unreliable. And in war, fixing something does not happen at a comfortable pace. It happens like a fire drill, except the building is already burning. The changes that produced the improved launcher were not glamorous. They were practical. They were about cutting away points of failure, simplifying operation, and making the weapon more tolerant of dirt, moisture, and careless handling. The goal was not perfection. The goal was consistency. The improved version, known as the M1A1, represented that push. The design was adjusted for easier production and better field performance. It was meant to feel less like a laboratory device and more like a real infantry weapon. A soldier should not have to treat it like delicate equipment. A soldier should be able to use it while tired, scared, and under fire. But a redesign only matters if it survives reality. Sicily in 1943 was a different kind of challenge. It was not endless desert. It was rugged ground, stone walls, hills, and narrow routes where vehicles moved carefully and infantry had to think in angles and cover. Armor still mattered, but the terrain created sudden encounters. Tanks appeared and disappeared behind rises and buildings. A rocket team might have seconds to set up, fire, and move before return fire found them. This was where the bazooka needed to prove it had grown up. At Bayaza Ridge, the pressure peaked. American forces faced an armored threat in conditions that did not allow for slow adjustments. Tanks did not politely wait for perfect firing posture. They moved, pressed forward, and tried to break through. In moments like that, an infantry anti-tank weapon becomes a lifeline, because infantry without one is forced into extreme solutions: mines under fire, close assaults with explosives, desperate calls for artillery that may not arrive in time. On that ridge, the bazooka did what it had been designed to do. It worked in the way soldiers had wanted it to work back in North Africa. It fired when it was supposed to. It delivered hits that mattered. It became a tool that could actually shape the outcome of a fight instead of just decorating a supply list. That kind of success does more than stop a tank. It changes belief. When soldiers see a weapon perform under pressure, their posture changes. They carry it differently. They plan around it. They start positioning teams with intention instead of hope. The bazooka began to move from last resort toward accepted part of infantry defense. But the story was not clean. Even with improvements, battlefield use still demanded discipline. Rocket teams had to understand range, angles, and armor zones. They had to coordinate with riflemen who protected them while they aimed. They had to pick moments where a shot had a real chance, because firing too early wasted ammunition and revealed position. Firing too late could mean death. The weapon also carried its own hazards. The backblast zone behind the launcher remained dangerous. Infantry had to learn to keep that space clear, especially in tight terrain. A rocket launcher does not only threaten the enemy. It can injure careless friends. A team that ignored this could hurt itself before the enemy even reacted. Still, the improvement wave was real. The bazooka's reputation began to recover, but recovery in war is never gentle. It happens through repeated proof, one engagement at a time. Each time the launcher fired successfully, it gained a little more trust. Each time it failed, it threatened to lose that trust again. American engineers kept pushing forward, already thinking beyond the M1A1. If the weapon could be made stronger, more durable, easier to handle, then infantry could rely on it not just as an emergency tool, but as a standard answer to armor threats. And the enemy was evolving too. German forces, developing their own launcher concept into a heavier weapon, would soon create new dangers on the battlefield. The presence of a more powerful rocket launcher in enemy hands meant Allied troops could face the same kind of shock that tanks once delivered, the sudden realization that infantry could kill armor, and could do it from closer than anyone wanted. In this escalating cycle, the bazooka was not just a weapon. It was part of a race. A race between invention and counter-invention, between battlefield need and industrial speed. The next chapter of the bazooka story would not be about whether it could work at all. It would be about whether it could become truly dependable across weather, terrain, and chaos. Because once a weapon proves it can succeed, the only question that matters is whether it can keep succeeding when the war refuses to make things easy. After Sicily, the bazooka was no longer treated like an awkward experiment. It had earned a different kind of attention, the kind reserved for tools that actually shape survival. But the war did not slow down to celebrate that shift. Every improvement had to keep pace with combat, and every design choice had to survive mud, cold, shipping damage, and nervous hands in the dark. The drive toward reliability turned into a steady push for a better model, one that could be produced in large numbers and used with fewer headaches. That push led to the M9, a launcher built to be more practical in the field. It was designed with the reality of infantry life in mind, where equipment gets dropped, soaked, dragged, and knocked against walls. A weapon meant for war has to expect disrespect. The M9 also fit the growing understanding of how rocket teams actually fought. Operators needed a launcher that could be carried more easily, handled in tight spaces, and kept ready without constant worry. The earlier models had already taught the harsh lesson that a weapon can be brilliant on paper and useless when the details fail. The M9 was a step toward making the bazooka feel less like a fragile device and more like a dependable companion. With that change came a different mood among infantry units. The bazooka began appearing in plans. It was positioned at likely armor approaches. Teams were assigned and trained with more consistency. Rocket ammunition was managed more carefully. The weapon was no longer just an exciting new thing. It was a responsibility. As the fighting moved deeper into Europe and into long, exhausting campaigns, the bazooka found its role again and again. Tanks still dominated open movement, but terrain and urban rubble created close encounters. Roads narrowed through villages. Stone walls and hedgerows turned fields into short-range traps. A tank that could rule at long distance could become vulnerable at close range, especially if infantry could slip to the side and strike where armor was thinner. That closeness created a special kind of tension. The bazooka did not reward fear, but it did not forgive sloppy courage either. A rocket team had to approach with calculation, using cover, timing, and the natural noise of battle to get close enough. It was not about charging forward. It was about moving like a shadow, reading the tank's movement, waiting for the angle that offered a real chance. Every successful hit reinforced the weapon's identity, not as a miracle, but as a tool that, when used well, could kill armor. For infantry, that knowledge changed the psychological weight of an armored threat. A tank was still terrifying, but it was no longer untouchable. The feeling shifted from helplessness to possibility. But the race continued. German forces fielded their own rocket launcher, the Panzerschreck, built with heavier power and a more intimidating presence. It was not only an answer, it was an escalation. It carried stronger punch and forced Allied troops to recognize that infantry anti-armor weapons now existed on both sides. If bazooka teams had learned to fear misfires, now they also had to fear being targeted by a similar weapon from an unseen corner. This back-and-forth evolution turned battles into layered danger. Tanks were threatened by rockets. Rocket teams were threatened by machine guns, snipers, artillery, and the enemy's own anti-tank teams. A bazooka shot could change a fight, but it could also invite instant retaliation. The weapon's smoke and backblast revealed position, and experienced enemy crews reacted fast. So even as the bazooka became reliable, its use remained nerve-heavy. Each shot was a commitment. Each firing position had to be chosen with an exit in mind. Teams learned to relocate quickly, to avoid becoming the next target. The bazooka was powerful, but it was never safe. As the war dragged on, stories began to rise around individuals who used the rocket launcher in ways that felt almost unreal. Some were infantrymen who stood their ground against armor when others could not. Some were leaders who adapted the weapon creatively, making it part of tactics that the original designers never imagined. These stories mattered because they gave the weapon a human face. The bazooka was steel and circuits and explosive force, but its real impact came through the people who carried it into danger and made it work under pressure. One of the most intense stages of that human story would unfold in Italy, where terrain and fortifications turned every advance into a grind. In places like Anzio, where battle lines locked into brutal tension, anti-tank weapons became essential not only for stopping armored pushes, but for protecting fragile footholds that could collapse if armor broke through at the wrong moment. The bazooka was now ready for that kind of test. It no longer needed excuses about batteries and rushed production. It had reached a stage where performance could be expected, which made the coming moments even sharper. Because once a weapon becomes dependable, the weight shifts back onto the person holding it. And soon, in the pressure of Italy, that weight would produce actions that echoed far beyond the range of any rocket. Italy turned warfare into a grinding test of nerves. The ground itself fought back, with steep ridges, stone farm walls, muddy lanes, and towns broken into hard angles. Armor could not always move freely, but when tanks did appear, they arrived in the most dangerous way, suddenly, close, and supported by fire that pinned infantry in place. In this kind of fighting, the bazooka stopped being a new invention and became something more personal. It became a tool that demanded someone step forward at the exact moment everyone else wanted to stay low. Not because they wanted attention, but because a tank did not care about fear, and a foothold could vanish if armor pushed through. Near Anzio in May of 1944, the pressure reached that sharp point where one action could change an entire stretch of ground. Van Barfoot, serving as a technical sergeant at the time, moved through the chaos of an assault that was already dangerous enough without armor joining it. The situation did not unfold like a clean plan. It unfolded like real battle, with confused movement, sudden bursts of fire, and positions that shifted in minutes. Later that day, German tanks counterattacked, and Tiger tanks came directly toward the line. Tigers were not just tanks. They were a statement. Heavy armor, powerful guns, and a reputation that could freeze infantry before the first shot even landed. This was where the bazooka's story stopped being about engineering and became about will. Barfoot used a bazooka against the lead Tiger, disabling it at close range and breaking the force of the attack. A single disabled tank could clog the path of the ones behind it, slow the surge, and turn a confident push into a stalled problem. In that moment, the weapon proved its purpose in the simplest possible way, not as a guarantee, but as a chance that could be turned into a result by someone who did not hesitate. The battle did not pause afterward. War never does. The same day demanded more movement, more risk, and more work under fire. The shape of that day became the kind of story armies remember because it showed the bazooka for what it had finally become, reliable enough that a determined soldier could bet his life on it and win. While Italy ground forward, another kind of bazooka legend began forming far to the north and west, where the war shifted into France after the landings of 1944. There, the battlefield looked different. Roads ran through hedgerows and villages. Fields were divided by thick green walls. Tanks advanced in narrow corridors, and infantry hunted for angles in a landscape that hid everything until it was almost too late. In that environment, some soldiers used the bazooka in ways it had been designed for. Teams crouched behind cover, waited for a flank, fired, and moved. But one American officer and pilot took the idea into the sky. Charles Carpenter flew a small liaison aircraft, a Piper Grasshopper-type plane built for observation and artillery spotting, not for fighting tanks. It was light, slow, and vulnerable. Its normal job was to look, report, and survive by staying out of trouble. Carpenter refused to accept that limit. He began mounting bazookas on his aircraft, turning a fragile observation plane into an improvised attack platform. The sight of it did not look like modern air power. It looked like something stitched together by stubbornness. A small plane flying low, close enough to be hit by rifles, carrying rockets meant for infantry shoulders. The danger was constant. At low altitude, everything could kill a light aircraft. Small arms fire. Machine guns. Even a lucky burst could tear fabric and wood apart. Every pass over enemy lines meant gambling against chance and the enemy's reflexes. Yet the effect was real. Carpenter attacked armored vehicles from above, striking where tanks were thinner and where crews did not expect a rocket to arrive. His aircraft became known by a nickname that carried both humor and threat, and his own nickname followed him into history as Bazooka Charlie. The deeper truth behind that legend was not comedy. It was the same hard requirement the bazooka always demanded. Getting close. Accepting exposure. Acting before the moment vanished. These heroic stories mattered because they showed two sides of the bazooka's identity. On the ground, it could be the desperate answer to a tank that was already too close. In the air, it could become a surprise weapon where no one expected it. In both cases, the bazooka did not create bravery, it only gave bravery something to hold. And the war kept tightening around that idea. Every time a bazooka team fired, the flash and smoke gave away their position. Enemy machine guns searched for the source. Shell bursts walked toward suspected firing points. Tanks learned to react quickly, turning their guns toward the smallest movement, trying to crush the threat before another rocket could be loaded. So even as the bazooka became dependable, it also made its users targets. The next step in the story was not about whether the weapon could be trusted. It was about what happened when both sides learned to expect it, when the battlefield adjusted, and when the bazooka's success began provoking new dangers that spread faster than the smoke from a rocket shot. The bazooka's story never followed a straight line. It started with a rush, stumbled through embarrassment, and survived long enough to become something the battlefield could not ignore. That transformation was not smooth, and it was never guaranteed. It happened because early failures were loud, undeniable, and dangerous enough that everyone involved was forced to respond. In North Africa, the launcher arrived with the optimism of a new idea and the weakness of hurried production. Misfires were not rare accidents. They were repeated frustrations. Batteries failed. Contacts corroded. Training was thin. A weapon meant to stop tanks sometimes behaved like a broken tool at the exact moment it was needed most. In the language of soldiers, that kind of failure becomes personal, because it happens at close range, in full view of danger. Those early disasters could have buried the concept entirely. Armies are not sentimental about equipment. If something fails too often, it gets replaced, and the people who had to carry it stop believing in it. The bazooka survived that stage for one reason. The idea behind it was too useful to abandon. The shaped charge warhead was real. A rocket could carry it. A soldier could aim it. And when the system worked, even briefly, it proved that infantry did not have to remain helpless against armor. That proof was like a spark. It was enough to keep engineers working, commanders requesting improvements, and training systems adjusting to make the weapon more usable. The strange twist was that the enemy believed in the idea too. Captured launchers, studied and adapted, helped inspire the German Panzerschreck, a larger and more powerful rocket launcher. This was the moment the bazooka stopped being only an American project and became part of the broader evolution of infantry anti-tank warfare. One side's rough invention pushed the other side to respond. The battlefield began changing around the concept, and once that happens, there is no going back to the old way. The Americans kept refining their weapon under pressure, stripping away weaknesses and simplifying handling. The improved M1A1 showed that fixes could turn shame into capability. At Bazooka Ridge in Sicily, the launcher's success was more than tactical. It was psychological proof that the weapon could be trusted in real combat conditions. After that, further development pushed toward a model that could live in the hands of ordinary infantry without constant worry. The M9 represented that maturation. More practical, more dependable, and easier to carry and manage, it helped move the bazooka into the category of standard infantry equipment rather than experimental gear. By then, bazooka teams had also learned their own hard lessons. They learned to use cover, to aim for vulnerable armor zones, to coordinate with riflemen, and to relocate quickly after firing. The weapon did not become effective by design alone. It became effective through the behavior it forced on its users. That is why the bazooka's story is not only a technical narrative. It is a story about adaptation. It also became a story about individuals whose actions made the weapon feel larger than its parts. In Italy, Van Barfoot faced a counterattack that included Tiger tanks and used a bazooka to disable the lead tank at close range, helping break the momentum of the assault. In France, Charles Carpenter turned a light observation aircraft into an improvised attack platform by mounting bazookas on it, attacking armored vehicles from above in a way that enemy crews did not expect. These moments did not change the bazooka's design, but they changed its legend, because they showed what could happen when a reliable weapon met decisive will. By the end of the war, the bazooka was no longer defined by the failures that haunted its beginning. It was defined by what those failures triggered: rapid repair cycles, training improvements, and a willingness to learn faster than the enemy. The weapon's early weakness became its forcing function, pushing American engineering and battlefield practice into a tighter loop of feedback and improvement. This legacy did not stop with one weapon model or one war. The bazooka demonstrated that infantry rocket weapons could exist as a practical answer to armor, and that once such a weapon appears, it reshapes tactics on both sides. Tanks could no longer assume that infantry were harmless at close range. Infantry could no longer assume they were doomed when armor arrived. The balance shifted, not into safety, but into a new kind of danger where both sides carried tools that could deliver sudden, decisive destruction. That was the bazooka's true impact. Not a perfect invention, but an imperfect one that survived its own flaws, evolved under pressure, and changed the expectations of modern ground combat forever.